Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther Developers Commentary.
Hi, I'm Robert Briscoe, I'm the artist on Dear Esther.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer on the game.
So what are you looking at?
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything. One of the things that I wanted to do with Dear Esther is bring the visuals up to the same kind of level of detail that Dan and Jess had put into the other areas of the game. So all of the history and the kind of hidden pieces of story that are intertwined with the VOs and the music and stuff, I kind of wanted to bring some of that into the environments. So if you look around you, you see that there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces, a piece of paper with someone's name on it, a photograph, an ultrasound. All of these little bits and pieces are kind of laid in to just kind of bring another aspect of the story into the game. And also, they're actually randomized, so every time you play, you'll see something different lying around. And this is just to build on this idea that everybody has a unique experience and a unique interpretation of the story.
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were. And I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that had played this game and then would have a conversation about it, and one of them would say, oh, what did you think about when this happened? And the other person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a completely different event happen or a completely different story happen. And it kind of feels very gamey in that way, that actually one of the things I love about writing for games is that you hand over so much control to the player that it becomes their story, and that's really, really important rather than trying to force them. So using randomised blocks of voiceover in the game and the kind of randomised prop details that Rob was talking about means...
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good things about that is it actually forced me to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my background in sound art, I wanted to use...
Everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike. This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, it's one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out of the commercial version because they felt like they were a little bit explicit. And instead, there's a lot more hidden kind of codes and symbols in there.
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter, there's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island that these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or you know, the characters that surround it. So you'll find that around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island. What's really interesting about this is one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, where you had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these practical constraints.
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before, based on a Christina Rossetti poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral music, and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely perfect for Esther, but I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get in the game is
White Lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bore and the Hebrides. If the disease broke out,
Really?
they'd actually chip out and expose the chalk. So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land because it was infectious, which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of those things where you go, it's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as cool as that. It just has to be something that was actually done. And it's so sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it feels really real because it references a real thing. And I don't know, there's something really special about that. But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought, we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to get these things in here.
Yeah, I mean, something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing, in the same kind of way that you have all of these little details, these very close attentions to detail that kind of really bring richness to the story, and something that was missing in the original mod version.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about cellador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. And Dear Esther actually comes from the introduction to From a Faith No More song, the Crab song on the first album, Introduce Yourself. And there's a point where, I think it's Chuck at that point as the vocalist, before Mike Patton, just says, Dear Esther. And it really lodged with me because the sound Dear Esther, it just has a really amazing sound to it. And I think when we started making it, and the idea of it being this series of letters to someone came through, it just came straight back out of going, that's just a really beautiful sounding combination of words. And I think that really sums up the whole approach to the writing in Dear Esther of what's the most beautiful combination of words and images we can put together. And I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have played it or are talking about it is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man walking across a Scottish island, or is it a dream that he's had does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what they thought was going on, and then to undercut it. So you never actually were able to settle on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the original mod, was can we put a story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you have will always have questions, and you'll never be able to fully trust what you think you understand about the game. So it's challenging, I think, for that result. It becomes quite a challenging kind of game story because of that, because you don't ever get that situation to go, I understand it now, I can walk away from this thing and it's all closed off and it's tidy. It was a very deliberate attempt to say, no matter where you think you are with this story, you're always questioning whether or not that's right.
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic. I wanted to leave room for the player to think and to dream and to wonder and to put their own interpretation into what was happening. And I think the problem with so much modern media is how bombarded we are constantly. It's the kind of MTV, flash in your face, constant music. And Dan and I watch a lot of drama together, and that really is constant
Endless,
music.
which is constantly telling you what you should feel, like really clearly, and it's like being kind of beaten up by the music sometimes.
And when you read a lot of reviews of Dear Esther, a lot of people say they had this time to think and to interpret, and that was one of their favourite things, that they placed themselves so directly into.
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate. One of the things we wanted to do is just kind of like not spoon feed the player every little piece of story. We kind of just, some things are literally just in there to just kind of let you think and let you decide on whatever you want to bring to the story yourself. So it's kind of like I approached it like an impressionist painting, where you've got like this kind of very vague outline of things, but if you stare at it enough, you can kind of like fill in the spaces, and kind of the image comes together on its own. So a lot of these kind of strange pieces of geography and stuff, that's really kind of deliberate in some ways, just to kind of keep the player's mind open and kind of bring their own interpretations of the story through that.
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself. So one of the things that I did with the music was to write the island as if she or he were a character in its own right. And that's really important, I think, that you're going...
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. So Esther was the first of the what are now called walking simulators, and it was really interesting that for us it didn't feel that weird to have a game that was slower than normal, where actually there was lots of time to just walk around and think and look at things. And it was amazing at the time how this was seen as completely revolutionary, and it's really interesting, and it's amazing to see how many other games have kind of like taken it on board. For me, it came from, I didn't see it as being odd to have a game where very little happened, where you thought about what you were doing. For me, it was kind of interesting that you could play some of the best moments in Doom. The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature, as well as its place within the story. And that, I think, came from, it was really interesting, it being a Half-Life mod to begin with, and the Citadel in Half-Life 2, that it tells you how far you are through the game. You're always looking up to the skyline, am I closer to the Citadel, can I see it? And it lets you know how near you are to the end of the game. And it was really important because Esther's so open in a way, and because there isn't this, you're not using kind of shootouts or kind of gating it with combat encounters to kind of constantly keep you moving. That it was really, really important that you always had that focal point of going, I know exactly from the beginning of the game, virtually right from the start, you know where you're going, you know where the game's going to end up, and you know that sooner or later you're going to be either at the base of that thing or climbing that thing, and it's always there, that red light. And I think particularly with the colour palette of the game, the fact that you've got this very, very, very clear red light that's unlike any of the other colours in the game immediately tells you as a player, this is what the shape of this thing is going to be, this is where I'm going, this gives me a purpose, even if the sort of moment by moment is a bit more abstract.
Yeah, and navigationally as well, it helps you, it draws you in the right direction as you play the game. You can never get lost if you just follow that one landmark.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place of where that sort of traditional game design is still, there's loads of it in Esther, it's just not necessarily done in quite the same way.
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, you know, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways, but something I wanted to bring to the game was that there's this second layer beneath the surface. Whereas if you look at things closely, you see that the actual island itself is very polluted. It's kind of
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time around. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him. And it was amazing when Nigel came in, we had, I think, a day and a half to do the whole thing. And he just did that amazing thing that really, really great actors did. If he just walked in, got in front of the microphone, and more or less did the entire thing in one take. And we did hardly any retakes on anything. It just felt like his instinct for the character in the game was so...
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like... I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we.
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point, they've played in a very sort of Scottish style, actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write, actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts, so the player can actually, just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which just is just epic, as Jess has said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky, there's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there, and I think it's just like all of these elements.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just... So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game's absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2, because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's absolutely terrifying because it's just this space and you're just left in it. So I think the kind of the bird here is really interesting because it can actually really, really make you jump. But I don't know if that was part of why people were saying that the game was really scary, but it was a real surprise when people started coming back and saying, this is a frightening game. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the ideas in the game are frightening when you think about them, and how much of it is to do with just the emptiness and the lack of kind of things in the game make it a really quite stressful.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few...
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker. And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space.
One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of like if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of it's not obvious. It's not in your face. It's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know, and so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to recreate that feeling, and it's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just...
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.